makes an award-winning podcast? And what are things that the judges are going to be looking into? I am answering these two questions in this week's episode. I'm going to be sharing 10 tips for you to consider when you're applying for podcast awards, or honestly, for anything that you may want to submit your podcast for. And as an award-winning marketer for podcasters and the founder of the podcast space, I work with podcasters from all walks of life. And this week, I am part of the judging panel for the International Women's Podcast Awards. This is the perfect time to share with you things that I've thought as a judge, but also as I've applied for awards for myself and won some, and others didn't get selected for. Like, what are some best practices that you should consider? Before we get into this week's episode of the podcast space, I want to remind you that if you found these podcasts useful, please share it with a friend, rate and review, because it really helps spread the word, because word of mouth is one of the best ways to get these podcasts into more ears. All right, let's dive right in. Let's start with the most important thing. What makes an award-winning pitch? Well, it kind of varies, and it will depend on the type of award that you're trying to submit or grants that you're trying to submit your podcast for. And the most important thing is that you ask yourself, is this actually relevant? To be honest, as someone who thinks about marketing and how podcasters present their message and their podcast, it's really important that you align the purpose of this pitch to, of course, the award that you're submitting your podcast for. And so in the past, I've been asked by clients to help them craft a compelling pitch for these awards that they were submitting the podcast to, or even I myself was in charge of doing that. But what makes an award-winning pitch or a pitch that's going to be selected is really making sure that this is like super simple, but at the same time, like really read the criteria. And I see so many people in the past, like when I worked in the nonprofit world, sometimes we would run competitions, and the amount of people who wouldn't read the rules and then, would be removed from the competition just because they didn't meet some criteria, honestly surprised me. So if anything, make sure that you read the FAQs, the frequent asked questions, but also the rules. When you're looking at what makes a compelling pitch, I think doing your homework or researching is the most important thing. So look into these type of awards. If it's not the first time that they're creating these awards for, like, look at the previous honorees, the previous nominees and winners. What type of profile do they have? What type of content was submitted, right? Like, this gives us a really good indicator of, and again, sometimes the jury changes every year, but what are the core characteristics that they're looking for? So some organizations will have more detailed information than others, but it's really important to read the fine print everywhere on the website. For some podcast awards in the industry, you're going to be competing with people who have huge teams and who have a minimum budget of $3,000 per episode. So if you're just having a really relaxed conversation with friends and you're not necessarily sharing anything incredibly groundbreaking, maybe you want to adjust what type of award you're applying to. And I'm not going to go through all the potential types of awards because there's so many on the internet, but I would literally just say, really think about all the potential categories that you could find online. So for instance, if you're a woman, think about what types of podcast awards you can apply for, local ones. If you're a small business owner, you can use a podcast as a way to share information in an alternative way. So when we're talking about alternative ways to use our content, let me share with you the award. And if you're looking on the video, you're probably seeing it as I'm trying to show you, but there's a lot of reflection. The award that I won for my work in podcasting in 2023, I applied and successfully got selected as a winner of the American Marketing Association Marketing Maverick Award. My goodness, so many marketing in American. So I was part of 10 people that got selected in their industry. And so even though the podcast space at the time, and again, this is marketing, right? This is how I share my message with you, how I share my brand, how I share a lot of education. So this award, which I'm going to put down, looked at different ways that people were submitting their work for. And again, I looked at hey, I know that there are not many marketers using the podcasts as tools to talk to their communities. And if you've followed these podcasts for a while, if you're new here, then let me share with you. The podcast space is really a podcast to help business owners and entrepreneurs that are impact driven, primarily from communities in multilinguals, female entrepreneurs, and minorities to really use the podcast as an effective tool for their business. And a lot of what I talk about here is, yes, like how do you use your podcast as like a marketing tool, but how things will happen in your like mindset and how you can navigate those things and how you build confidence and like you show up as an authentic leader in your industry. And so I thought, hey, like I have the podcast and also like I of course have like everything else about my brand connected to the podcast space because it's the name of the podcast and the company. And again, that was something that I thought, well, hey, like I'm a woman, I am in Dallas. So again, a local chapter that was open for submissions. So I looked at how I could find a unique angle to market my expertise using the podcast as a vehicle. So when you're looking around at like how you're using your podcast in your business or just to create change, look at these different angles. Or if you fall within a specific category like an industry, like let's say you are into the tech world, you could totally submit your podcast for a tech like leader in the industry, because even though it feels like everyone is, hosting a podcast, it's not so much as it was in 2020. So basically, there's over 3 million podcasts in 2024. The last quarter revealed that only about 300,000 podcasts of those 3 million ones are actually active and sharing content frequently. So when you look at the data, there aren't that many people. So let's say you are an immigrant. So look at ways to, even though you don't have to like have a podcast in that language, again, unless the rules say so. But if you don't, like look into how you can position every single part of your life. Like you can look at that as like a winning element of a pitch. So this is tip number 2. When you're writing the pitch and looking at the relevancy of the show for the award, really think about like how you can go through the steps that take you the longest time with some help. And what I mean by this, like when I won my award, I actually spent about 2 hours working with ChatGPT to iron out that application. Because I know that as a multilingual, a lot of times it's hard for me to think in English or even think in Portuguese. And so sometimes it's easier for me to put things like bullet points, feed something to ChatGPT, and then work through that application in multiple steps. So for instance, when you're writing a pitch, think about what people have said. So if you have rates and reviews of the podcast, those will inform how the podcast is changing lives, and quotes are really powerful. And so you can use those. You can also use quotes from previous guests that you had on the show, and how the podcast really is changing your community. So even if it's not necessarily, on a podcast platform, but it is available, for instance, on a social media comment or an email that someone sent. Those are really key, valuable points that sometimes help us work through like a blind spot when we're writing our application. For me, I was looking through what does take me the longest, and it's writing. So again, don't think that you have to be a martyr and you have to create the thing from scratch. And if you're using ChatGPT or any other AI is quote unquote cheating, it isn't. It's just basically looking at your handicaps and how can we help ourselves move through the process. Because I can promise you, that writing a lot of these pitches will feel sometimes like you're an imposter. You're like, oh my gosh, like so many other podcasts out there, they're so good. Like, why should I apply? So trust me when I say collecting like those quotes from other people that listen to the podcast or who are in your community will really help you when it's time to write down like why this podcast is great. So also make sure that when you're looking at writing this pitch, give yourself plenty of time, but also give yourself a deadline. And don't do it until the last day. Sometimes when you're working through your script, some things will come up. And so a great tool is to use your social media channels to say, hey, I'm submitting my podcast for a few awards. I would love if you could help me, share some quotes that really have helped you through, the journey that you're in. So let's say you use it for business, or like say that your podcast is about mental health or overcoming something. As you are collecting those answers, your audience will be primed to know that, hey, like this person is submitting their podcast for an award. And so they'll also be keeping that in mind if you get like to the next round and you need their help to vote. You're not just like out of the blue, hey, everybody, I submitted my podcast to this awards and like, I need you to help me, right? Like we're bringing in and people will be more invested in. All right, number 3, really think about the people who are doing the work. We want to make sure that 1, there's no room for error. Number 2, that as they are collecting the information, we're not making it harder for them. It's not that they're going to hold it against you, but if we can make the process as smooth as we can, that would be great. Now, number 4, literally make a list on the side. Do include all the requested information. So if they're requesting links, add them. Even if they say, hey, if you want, add the links. Do add the links. Just make sure that the person judging your entry is able to make a decision informed on the whole information. So let's say you're self-funded. Say that you're self-funded. If the podcast has received any other awards, say that as well. If the podcast has seen an immense growth, if you've been podcasting for, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, if you had some setbacks, include those. Those paint a picture of why you're worthy of deserving that award. Now, another one would be definitely when we're talking about including all the requested information, normally these go through the links, transcripts, audio files, and by the way, always make sure that you're providing audio files in the format that they need, and they're normally going to be MP3 or WAV. WAV tend to be a little heavier, and honestly, unless you're providing a sonic experience, you don't need to, and MP3 will do just fine. So when you're looking at additional assets and letters, sometimes they have hey, tell us why this podcast is worthy in how many characters or less. That is another tip. This is tip number 5. Make sure that when you're sending those links, you're double checking to make sure that all of these links work, all the files work. And a personal note, something that I think I remember from a hiring manager that was talking about this. And so when you're submitting assets, make sure that you're naming your asset also with your name or the name of the company or the name of the podcast. So basically, when people are looking at a bunch of files, they can look at who this file belongs to. And so it's so much easier when it's theirs, sorting through the whole process. If everything is structured in the same file name and type, or it identifies the applicant. So last but not least, make sure that when you're including all of the submission, that you have requested the approval and the confirmation that it's okay to submit that work from everyone involved, because nothing is worse than submitting your podcast for an award or submitting your work for an award, and then you have to retract that or you have to make an amendment. So make sure that when you're submitting everything, it is submitted with all the right information and the final everything, right? So make sure that you're also not naming files like V1, final V2. Who isn't guilty of that? As we're getting to the middle of the list, I want to make a little break for something that I think is so, so important. You never know who's competing against you. And what I mean by that is that it could mean that your podcast is incredible. The moment is fantastic. What you're sharing is great. But if you're competing with shows that perhaps are more powerful, that perhaps are not necessarily to the level they're competing in, you could be benefiting or you could be penalized by it. So know that when you're submitting a podcast for an award, you don't really know who else is entering. And this is an incentive for you as well to submit your podcast to awards, even if it feels a little bit, you're punching above your waistline or you're really trying something more adventurous. Of course, I'm saying if it's relevant. If it isn't relevant, don't try it. Don't waste the jury's time. But make sure that hey, you could be submitting yourself for a podcast, and for whatever reason, all of these air quotes big players could be missing that award, or something could happen. So you never know, you may be having bigger chances than you think. So number 6, that is kind of tied in when you're submitting your podcast to have plenty of time, is to really ask someone else to review your assets or to review the file that you're submitting for the podcast award, or just a whole file, and give them a chance to provide insightful feedback. And again, don't just ask your mom or your grandma. They may not know anything about it. Submit it to someone that you trust their judgment. Or for instance, some clients, sometimes they will send me, hey, I'm going to be submitting for this. Would you mind just having a read on this? Because I know you always think about things that I don't think about. So Whether that's like the angle, whether that's something that I remember that they did that I was like, hey, there was this thing, this one quote from a guest or something that I thought was really relevant. I think it would be tying in really nicely on this section here. So you are thinking about opportunities to really leverage that content in a different way when you're asking someone else to do it. So don't be ashamed. Don't feel like you're like, oh my gosh, nobody cares. Like, I've been asked for my view on like what would make a snippet good from someone else's podcast. And I don't mind it at all because I know that at some point I'm going to ask that person back. All right, number 7, going through the process and really thinking about like, and this is like a little bit on a side note, but really thinking about how you've changed as a host and acknowledging that process as you are going through these pitch application. So when you're thinking about that, like, honestly, I always think about how hard it was for me in the beginning of the show, like in January of 2023, to talk directly to the camera, to like get in the habit of doing this, to think about the show, to practice and like look through, like checking the camera was right, like the light, the microphone, all of these things that like take time. Like really think about like all your wins and where your podcast started, where your podcast is now, because there's an amazing thing about acknowledging your journey just for yourself. So it's not necessarily about the pitch itself, but it will really help you cement this idea that you are worthy of applying to a podcast award, even though it may feel like there's, tons of podcasts out there. But the reality is, people choose to listen to your podcast is because your content is good or you have something that people want. So just sitting in that moment, in that process, will really help you realize that you will craft a better pitch when you just understand like, yes, like I'm creating really good change through my content. All right, number 8, being an award-winning anything will really help you stand out. And why is this? Again, like taking the time to apply for awards, even if you don't know the outcome, is worthwhile. But when you win those awards, and again, there's so many awards, sometimes it feels like, like people are just giving awards left, right, and center, and it doesn't matter. But think about all the people that have award-winning next to the name. It's a lot less than the ones that don't have award-winning somewhere in their title, right? Like in the beginning of this episode, I share with you that I'm an award-winning podcast marketer. And you were like, yeah, like she won an award. She knows her stuff, right? So there's that idea that creates a positive bias toward the quality of our work, which is always excellent. And again, always deliver on what you're promising, of course. So make sure that when you're thinking about submitting a podcast for an award, you do that. Number 9, use AI to clean up and correct your transcript and any typos that may have happened in the pitch or the transcript. And I think that this is such an easy thing to do, and it will avoid just looking a little messy. Because again, sometimes when you're looking at something for the 100th time, there will be things that you'll be missing. Whether you're multilingual or a bilingual or you just speak one language, just make sure that you're submitting your podcast to an AI tool to just make sure that it's corrected. And then number 10, when you're submitting a clip for an award, number 1, do respect the time limits. That's incredibly important. And then number 2, make sure that if you're submitting a podcast clip, and again, look at the criteria, but I would always advise people to select a clip that has some context into it. Especially for people who are thinking like, oh, social media, less is more. I want a sound bite. Like, I want something that is powerful. But the reality is, think about it like, if I am a jury and I'm looking at your content and I have no context, if that's an award that has no context, like, do make sure that you're including like a longer side of a segment. So it's kind of getting me in the mood of getting into the scenario of what's going on, the scene, paint me the scene of what's going on. And so if you're submitting, and sometimes this is like an additional tip on the files themselves. And so sometimes what happens is that you can submit a file, but let's say the original file is not requested. You can go and remove a few things from that. Let's say there's like some hesitations, some some dramatic pauses that don't need to be there. Like really create and craft a better file just for the person to have a better listening experience. So let's make sure that if you want to submit something that is more compact, that it packs a ton of stuff that isn't like kind of like going sideways and coming back. So if you have some freedom to do some editing, do it. Of course, you don't want to do something that is nothing to do with the original file. But when you're looking at the content itself of this file, I want to ask you, is it you? Let's say it's a conversation between you and your guest. And in that segment, you're not doing any of the heavy lifting. And your guest is doing all of the thing, but you're submitting the podcast as you being the one who should be awarded for it. Like, think about the focus you're giving to that like pitch, because if your pitch and your file don't necessarily like intersect, it could be creating a little bit of a confusing moment for the juries. So make sure that when you're creating a clip, you're providing enough context. This is not like necessarily like a real soundbite or whatever. Like, it's not supposed to be just like something punchy and then we go, right? Like that the person listening to the segment does have an ability to listen to something and feel like, yeah, like I am getting a good grasp of what's going on here. All right, last but not least, what makes good storytelling? Anyone these days, if you were to look online, everyone's talking about like create storytelling, create moments that are worthwhile sharing. And a lot of people think that that means that it has to be highly produced, that it needs a lot of sound effects, it needs a lot of production. But I want to make a little side note for all of my people who are thinking like, oh, you know, my first language isn't English. Maybe I don't have the most powerful microphone, or my sound design skills are not the best. Again, at the core, think about what is being requested from this pitch, and is like having a very cool microphone part of the pitch requirements? No, probably not. So don't try to think about like what you don't have versus what you already have. There's been so many instances in the quote unquote like underdogs doing an excellent job at like surpassing people who had the funding, who had all the things that were like quote unquote supposed to have to win awards. So you really never know what the the criteria is involved and also who you're competing against. So the reality is, at its core, is it relevant? Is it exciting? Is it beautiful? Is it a moment that people will remember? Or it's a moment that changes someone? That can be powerful storytelling. And so when you're looking at something like when I look at this podcast, like I, of course, wouldn't submit this podcast to like best documentaries or something like that. But I would definitely submit like this podcast if it was like moments of entrepreneurship, thoughts that I want to change, like something about mindset. Small moments in our podcast really change people's lives, and we may not be aware of because we're just looking at the whole. But by selecting some really powerful moments, we can completely improve the quality of this teaser, these pitch that we're trying to make. So let's make sure that whenever we're submitting something, it's like a cohesive product, and that like really is at its core beautiful moments that make someone think about life a bit harder or a bit slower, or make us stop whatever we're doing. And last but not least, if you're looking for help to grow your podcast, to look at your podcast strategically, to help you grow your influence, I'm here to help you. So go and visit thepodcastspace.com. I'll have a link in the show notes. And if you can, please share with me your ahas on Instagram at the podcast space. So same thing. So not hard at all to remember. And until I see you in the next episode, keep creating content that's imperfect but moves you forward.